Hello, listeners! It's the month of March, and all sorts of holidays are celebrated. But today, we are focusing on celebrating the month of March for women all over the world. In this podcast, we are going to take a deeper dive into the history of women with voices from our very own SIS community. We will talk about all sorts of women, starting off with women in leadership. Ms. Manel is the head of the high school English department, so let's hear from her first. Starting off, how did you gain your position as the head of the English department?
Mr. Macklin typically asks for those who are interested to apply, and so I applied last year after Mr. Young left. Just felt like it's something that I work well with the other members of the department, and so I applied to Mr. Macklin, and that's how I got the English department position.
Yep. Now, why do you think there are so few women in leadership positions?
Well, I think, historically there's been fewer women in leadership positions. I think something that's pretty great here at SIS is that we do have a fair number of women in leadership positions. And so that makes sure that those voices are heard, right? We have a lot of female teachers, we have a lot of female students, and just having those perspectives involved in the leadership is, I think, super important because otherwise those views get ignored.
Great. Now, can you discuss any female role models or mentors who have influenced you in any way?
I've worked with quite a few English teachers in the past who have been women, strong women that really, I think, speak their minds and, stand up for those around them. I think those have been important people to sort of guide me, like show me what a good leader looks like.
And regardless of gender, what do you think are some important qualities of a leader?
I think the most important is listening to people. And I think that's not what people typically think about for a leader. They might think like a strong voice or somebody who's really assertive or confident. But I think really it's about hearing what others think and being able to, stand up for and take that perspective and try to work it into, what needs to be done.
Now, let's hear about women in the arts. Miss Ireland is our high school art history teacher, and she will share her perspectives and opinions with us. As an art history teacher, you are very knowledgeable about the history of artists, so are there any specific female artists who you would want to highlight?
One woman who always comes to mind is Frida Kahlo, so somebody that is extremely well known now. But at the time, her husband, Diego Rivera, who is also an artist, was much more well-known than she was. But now, that's kind of reversed, so people are much more likely, I think, to know Frida Kahlo's work. I think part of that is because of the way that she partly challenged beauty standards, the way that she represented her own story. She lived a really hard life. She was in an accident when she was pretty young, and so she had to go through a lot of surgeries throughout her life. She had a lot of issues with her husband Diego, and also she thought a lot about her dual identity. So her mom was Mexican, her dad was European. So she was thinking a lot about how these aspects made up her identity. So I think her representation of self has really resonated with a lot of people today and caused her to be much, much more famous and well known than her husband was at the time that they were alive.
Great. Now, what were some milestones for women in the art world?
So traditionally, women's artistic practices have been, throughout history, more related to practices like the fiber arts that for a long time weren't really an accepted part of the fine art world. So, artists who are sewing or doing quilting or weaving or other practices with fibers. It wasn't until, I would say, the 1990s that those kind of practices start to get really widely accepted within the world of fine art. So there's a few artists in particular who really get their work to be displayed in that fine art context. So Faith Ringgold is an artist who's really well known for making these story quilts about African American experience. And she uses these traditional fiber processes in a fine art setting to also kind of honor those practices that are oftentimes associated with women's artistic expression.
What challenges do you think women have faced in the art world?
having to like care for their families, or even access to artistic training. It's been more challenging for women to get notoriety as artists, even to like find spaces to exhibit their art, to seek out patrons who are going to, give them a salary for creating. I think now that's not so much of an issue as we have changes in societal expectations, but I think that it's still something that women today have to think of because there's sometimes responsibilities that society expects.
Great. Now, as an educator, do you try to include a lot of female recognition in your classes?
Yes, so I'm always trying to make sure that I show a balance of works that are by artists of different genders, artists from like Western and non-Western backgrounds, to provide that balance, whether my students realize it or not. I'm always trying to kind of make sure that I'm showing a variety of artists from a variety of backgrounds. Throughout history, maybe they might not be the artists that we think of first, but their work is equally as significant in the history of art. So especially with older periods, I always try and seek out at least one example of a woman who was practicing at the time that we know a lot about their practice.
Moving on to Women in STEM, Ms. Campbell is one of our school's science teachers who will share her point of view and personal experiences with STEM. Starting off with the first question, what inclined you to pursue a STEM career?
I was the valedictorian at my high school, and I did well in a lot of subjects. Like, I wrote a lot, I enjoyed writing, I enjoyed English. I was in the band, I toured Europe with an orchestra the summer before my senior year. But what came easily to me, what I sort of fell in love with, was science. I just couldn't stop thinking about it. Like, I would forget to eat because I was engaged in doing science fair projects. And I had a female teacher for biology who I respected a lot. And I guess I could just see myself doing the same type of work that she did.
Great. Now, did you run into any challenges or obstacles when trying to pursue your career in STEM?
When I started to run into friction, I guess, societal friction about it, was when I started teaching physical sciences. But I would go to meetings, and in the physical science department would be me and 5 guys, and they would ask me to take the minutes because I had the secretarial skills. My high school physics teacher told me that I could not be the president of the science club, but I could be the secretary of the science club. He also said that I could babysit his children. He never said that about the boys in the club. So there has been, and this thing about taking the minutes, I haven't experienced that here, but very recently I've still experienced that in my career. So it's not like that's changed enough. There is a societal norm about the work that women are good at or the work that women can do, and it tends to be planning parties, detail-associated work like taking minutes, keeping track of things. It's not usually leading, making the decisions that matter. And that's, I think, where the glass ceiling is. There's a lot more women in science than there used to be. There's not a lot more women in power.
Now, for the last question, are there any particular women who you see as role models in the STEM field?
I'm really impressed that Marie Curie has an element named after her. Liz Meitner also. The 2 women in the periodic table are Madame Curie and Liz Meitner. There are a lot of women, actually, who made sacrifices of their health, their well-being, to be able to make advances in science. And very often, they were not given the credit for their work. We didn't hear a lot of stories about successful women in science. Just, Nobel Prize winners. And I think that the stories matter. I think being able to tell the stories of these women and show how, in spite of all the obstacles they had to overcome or to endure, and some of them never overcame those obstacles, like the rest of us, they just endure to the end. I think it helps people feel not alone on the path.
Now, let's hear from our school's world history teacher, Ms. Nam, who will share much insightful information with us. As a world history teacher, you know a lot about historical figures. So, are there any particular women who you would want to highlight?
I personally think throughout the history, there are more women that are either not recognized or kind of got forgotten in the process. There are more women that we need to remember or acknowledge for sure. But I think the woman that I would like to talk about today is Emily Roebling. She was the one to finish the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge. She was married to an engineer whose family was responsible for building a Brooklyn Bridge. And during the process, her father-in-law died, who was the chief engineer in the project. And obviously her husband also kind of fell ill. That happened in the first 3 years of the project. So she stepped in and she wanted to finish the project. And as you can imagine, 1800s, it was like 1860s. So women didn't even have rights to vote. You can imagine that people were not really happy, or they would let women be in charge of such a big project. So she did a lot of things under her husband's name. I'm pretty sure the process was not easy for her, especially her being a woman. I thought of it one day like, oh, if I was her, could I do it for like 11 years? You know, trying to, every time I want to process something or do something, I have to prove or build that trust to even have a chance to negotiate or talk about something. So I think in that way, I do have like so much respect for her.
Great. Now, in trying to pursue your work and career, did you come across any challenges regarding your gender?
I don't really encounter the gender discrimination or inequality in general, but I do think that there are some assumptions or stereotypes here and there. Like, for example, if I tell people that I'm a teacher, they would assume that, oh, do you teach elementary, or do you teach, kindergarten or things like that. I mean, there might be many factors, right? It can be like an age or appearance thing as well. It can be many factors, but I do think that a lot of people would assume that, more of a female teacher will be teaching lower grades, and more of like male teachers would be more suitable to teach upper grades, I guess.
Now, for our final guest, let's hear from Ms. Dirksen, who is one of our school's PE teachers, and who will share her personal experiences with being a woman in athletics. Starting off, have you run into any challenges as a woman in athletics?
Of course. I think the biggest thing, and we know this from like research and stuff too, that as women, some of the hardest things is like body image and just like who you are and what you look like. And sport does things to your body, right? Depending on which sport you play, right? You start to get this physique. And so I think a lot of girls, including me, like it's not always like seen as like cool to be like a strong girl, right? And if you do sports pretty high level, you get pretty buff and you're strong. And so that can sometimes be a challenge socially, like with friends. Like I always got called like a tomboy, or like my name's Danica. People call me like Dan the Man. So like things like that people kind of pick up on and then kind of exploit. Yeah, so I swam from when I was 6. My parents accidentally signed me up for like a swim team. We lived in the Caribbean for a couple years, and they wanted us to just take like lessons, and then we signed up for this thing, and it was like a swim team. And then when I moved back to Canada, I swam. And then basically from grade 8 through to 3rd year university, I swam really competitively.
Great. Now, what were some big milestones for women in athletics?
Yeah, one of the pictures that comes to mind, maybe you've seen this one, there's an image of this woman getting like grabbed by men, and it was the first woman who ever ran the Boston Marathon. Her name's Kathrine Switzer, and she entered in as a man, like under a man's name, and then ran the race. And so partway through the race, they realized like this was a woman running the race, and so they tried to like grab her and take her off the course. She was born in 1947, so I think this happened in like the 60s, 70s, but like that wasn't that long ago. So that's a pretty famous image that just comes to mind when I think about that.
Now, final question. As a PE teacher, do you try and encourage young girls to participate a lot in sports and athletics?
Yes, and I think this is the hardest part of my job is how do we inspire girls who face like societal challenges, right? Society, I'm generalizing here, but like society in general doesn't really tell girls that they should be strong, right? Or they should break a sweat or be super muscular, right? And so how do we teach girls that like it's cool to be those things? If you like playing sports, it's okay. And so that's like, and just in the world, that's a really hard thing, especially in like the middle school to early high school age group where we start to like really feel like self-conscious about ourselves. And so as a teacher, I'm always trying to model like it's cool to be strong and it's cool to have fun and play with your friends and be silly and be goofy. And so some things I do in class is to like make sure if we're doing a demonstration, let's say in basketball, I don't just pick the boys to demonstrate. I pick some girls to demonstrate as well. That way it's not like, oh, the boys are the good at sports, they get to demonstrate. It's like everyone might get called and picked on. As a teacher, that's something that I struggle with is how to help them the best. And I'm always asking them to. So if students have an idea of how we can do this better at SAS, let me know because we are always trying to improve.
And there, all our interviews come to a close. I would like to thank all of the teachers in our community who have deeply contributed to this episode by taking the time to share their opinions. Women continue to rise, breaking barriers and building a more inclusive and equitable world for future generations. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, remember to celebrate the woman in your life, not just this month, but every single day.